Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents We Hold Our Breath, A Journey to Texas Between Storms, by Micah Fields. Narrated by Micah Fields. The literature of the city, nearly but not all modern literature, is panoramic, sometimes celebratory, often horror-struck. The hubbub of voices speaking different languages or dialects, the conglomeration of apprehended fragments. Its medium is the collage, its science that opposites attract, its logic that every proposition and its converse are equally true. Elliot Weinberger. After all, anybody is as their land and air is. Gertrude Stein. Most of Houston will spend eternity in hell. Billy Graham. Author's note. This is how a flood is born. It comes in sneaking increments of inches and hours. It arrives with the soft accumulation of a drizzle, innocent at first, sent down from the pent-up moisture of heaving clouds. At first, the rain falls into a dutiful chain of events. It gathers on the shoulders of roads, shedding off windshields and roofs, forming impromptu creeks in the gutters and sidewalks. It organizes itself quietly, obeying commands as simple as gravity and slope, occupying insignificant depressions, an upturned leaf, the shallow bowl of a pothole, a dip in a driveway. Droplets absorb into grass and soil. Parched concrete holds what it can. Asphalt swells. Drains swirl. Children, loading a bus for school, carry the trivial weight of rain in their soaked clothes and hair. In a parking lot, a man's car, the sunroof left open, accepts the gift of rain onto its upholstered interior, onto its seats and plastic console. Rivulets fill the small basins of cup holders. The reality of a flood, its basic principles, are simple. We know how they work. But the event itself challenges the imagination. The essential ingredients of a flood, the possibility of rain without end, its ability to rise and consume, the artful treachery of water, confound us. In this sense, the defining characteristic of a flood, more than any sight or sound or smell, is surprise. It is no secret the city was built on a foundation of mud. The errors involved are obvious, and the question of reasoning is useless, for its answer is lost in the mouths of the long dead. Instead, the most popular concern, the one that is repeated by outsiders until it has taken the form of an allegation, a condemnation, a slur, is why we stayed. Chapter 1. Empire of Mud. Consider, for starters, the shamelessly provocative roots of its name, a title chosen by the city's founders as a strategy to garner political favor from Sam Houston, the president of the new Republic of Texas, aka Kalanu, or the Black Raven, to his Native American compatriots with whom he was close. A sour-mouthed, hard-living Virginian who preferred following deer tracks to the pursuit of notoriety and fame, whose life was mired in scandal, punctuated by salacious disputes and self-imposed exile. The former congressman who once, after a heated spat on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives concerning legislative efforts to secure provisions for the soon-to-be-displaced nation of the Cherokee, whom he defended, chased down and thrashed the hind of Ohio Representative William Stanberry with a hickory cane in broad daylight on the streets of Washington. A figure the poet William Carlos Williams described as a man of primitive vigors, a man who, when in deep thought, whittled pine sticks and wore tiger-skin vest, blanket, sombrero, joined Baptist church, opposed secession of southern states, lived to have Lincoln recognize him by offer of a major generalship, which he refused. An imposing figure for his time, at well beyond 6 feet, whose substantial frame commanded respect by nature of its upper features alone. His pupils frozen lagoons set beneath his gleaming bald butte of a forehead, his tight frown lodged between granite jowls, the broad prow of a nose, and his chin, slightly upturned and gracefully dimpled as if thumped from a great distance by an enemy musket ball. Legend maintains he was an exacting force of rage in battle, leading his troops valiantly across the sodden plains of southeast Texas. Hobbled by a bullet-shattered ankle, he commanded his unit to defeat a rested and oversized Mexican army in 18 minutes flat on horseback, then galloped his stallion upriver to capture the disguised and retreating President of Mexico, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, whereupon he accepted the general's surrender and sparked the subsequent bloody tumult and acquisition of land without which there would be no Nevada, no Utah or California, no West as we have come to know it. He was a chronic shatterer, it was gossiped, with a fervor only glossed by blushing historians of Victorian hearts, a shirker of tedious responsibility, a flight risk prone to idleness and wandering in childhood, a brusque and disagreeable parent at best, entirely absent at worst, a phony unionist and owner of slaves, a boisterous lout in dungarees and crumpled shirts, a drunk. Nowadays, driving from the city's center outward, cutting a line toward Dallas on Interstate 45, you will encounter his effigy twice in 1 hour. First, he is cast in bronze, pointing far off from his saddle, perched on a stone arch in Herman Park. Then he is found towering roadside in Huntsville, a 67-foot mold of bone-white concrete, that menacing cane in hand. The statue is perched on a 10-foot-high granite slab, and inside Sam's colossal head a cement mixer was buried, the very machine employed to build the figure after it died on the last day of construction. A tribute to courage, the statue's dedication reads. It is worth noting before anything else that this brazen attitude was the city's first inheritance, that the city arose from a period of conflict and national anxiety, preceded by the reputation of a remarkable, unstable man, spawned by the swollen imaginations of East Coast prospectors, disputed, won, and gouged out from the sucking bowl of a swamp, stamped and wrought into domestic submission. From this tradition of resistance, to predominant sense and judgment and decorum, to the land itself, for better or worse, it carved its image. By pure tenacity, it managed to exist. By similar measures, it got its name. By plow and pavement, it sustained its people. Against mud and insult, it found its way. Looking at it now in the privilege of context, it is no wonder some believe this city was a giant mistake. From a contemporary vantage, the choice to settle here does seem immediately absurd. The soil is too soft. The weather is no good. The air is thick, and the water is foul, filled with all manner of natural threats. Alligators, water moccasins, tricky currents, festering bacteria, swarms of mosquitoes, putrid moats of quicksand, and on and on. The city itself sits on a large county, and the defined borders of the county, as they were drawn up and finalized in 1838, appear arbitrary at a glance, irregularly shaped and sharp at one end, like the compressed lower half of an animal's jaw. To its west, the jaw juts into a region of dense Texas timber, and from there it stretches nearly 75 miles east, ending in Galveston Bay, on the Gulf of Mexico's northwestern shoulder. To the north and south, its perimeter runs parallel with the silten bottomlands of rivers that race toward the coast, carrying the dirt and rain of other states. The county's surface follows a subtle, water-bound slant, and its average elevation ranges between 0 and 100 feet above sea level. In the whole 1,777 square miles of the county of Harris, where nearly 5 million live, there are no significant rises or dips to speak of. It is not a place, generally, where people speak of views. Confronted with this flat and dreary country in 1836, land speculator Augustus Allen's response was to lie. He knew the setting was not ideal. He knew he could not lure people, especially moneyed, urban-born settlers, to a remote swamp situated on the tenuous frontiers of an infant republic without some risky exaggerations. Allen, who, along with his brother John, had purchased the land practically sight unseen for less than $1 per acre, knew there were characteristics of the place that he could not change with any store of time or labor. He didn't care. He thought only of perception and how he might manipulate it. When the rich lands of this country shall be settled, a trade will flow to it, making it, beyond all doubt, the greatest interior commercial emporium of Texas, wrote Allen in August 1836, in an announcement with the Telegraph and Texas Register, intending to entice gullible migrants southward. His spiel continued. Nature seems to have designated this place for the future seat of government. It is handsome and beautifully elevated, salubrious and well-watered, and now in the very heart or center of population, and will be so for a length of time to come. There is no place in Texas more healthy, having an abundance of excellent spring water, and enjoying the sea breeze in all its freshness. No place in Texas possesses so many advantages for building, having pine, ash, cedar, and oak in inexhaustible quantities. Also, the tall and beautiful magnolia grows in abundance. In the vicinity are fine quarries of stone. In more accurate terms, what the Allen brothers had acquired was a wasteland. The salubrious and well-watered qualities Augustus had touted were, in fact, a confusing network of bayous, the southern parlance for that peculiar blend of swamp and canal, a bastardization of bayuk, the Choctaw word for small stream, characterized by sluggish, turbid currents, home to sunning gators and steep, slippery banks. The system's main artery, Buffalo Bayou, collected its sibling tributaries before trickling into the shallow, warm-water bays of the Gulf. At the time Augustus first glimpsed it, Buffalo Bayou was no more than a prominent ditch. It could hardly accommodate a dugout canoe, much less a hulking steamer loaded with freight, but it was this ditch, the Allens believed, with hefty imagination, that would link Houston to the currents of trade and transform a difficult swamp into the greatest interior commercial emporium of Texas. The Allens' claim also included a significant spread of soft coastal marsh blanketed by a dense, peculiar dirt, a substance heavy in clay and loam, later known as Houston Black, the official state soil, a nuisance to farmers and itinerants alike. In drought, settlers learned, the soil gave way to deep, gaping cracks across the plains. In morbid instances, the cracks were known to trap and fracture the legs of wandering cattle and horses, forming a perilous, impassable hazard. When wet, the mud halted wheeled travel, bogging the axles of wagons and carts, and in heavy rains, after it absorbed what moisture it could, the mud assumed an impervious layer, the solid bottom of an earthen bowl, flooding the vicinity. Visitors cursed the stuff. Walking proved a filthy chore. sickness thrived in the often stagnant pools of floodwater and marsh. The foundations of early structures sank and warped on the soft sponge of their property. Later, in the relative privacy of his memoirs, Augustus would offer a more truthful account of his city's construction, the mud a prominent villain. One could hardly picture the jungle and swampy sweet gum woods that a good portion of this city is built upon. The swampy grounds had to be cleared and drained. The labor of clearing the great space was done by Negro slaves and Mexicans, as no white man could have endured the insect bites and malaria, snake bites, impure water. On the backs of those laborers and slaves, under the direction of Augustus and his comrades, the town emerged in spite of its resistant setting. From the very start, visitors slung harsh criticism at the city. They mocked the dream the Allens struggled to set in motion. In 1848, the Catholic missionary Emmanuel Henry Dieudonne Dominic soiled his boots in the ankle-deep slop that covered the place. In correspondence, fed up and self-righteous, he complained the settlement was infested with Methodists and ants, and deemed it a wretched little town composed of about 20 shops and 100 huts, dispersed here and there among trunks of felled trees. In 1854, a Methodist bishop himself, James O. Andrew, would lay his own curses upon the young metropolis, prescribing it an urgent moral cleansing. The town, I suppose, contains some 2,000 inhabitants, who are said to be friendly and hospitable. I noticed grog shops in great abundance, and I fear they do a prosperous business. Beyond all doubt, there is a great need for a deep, a thorough, a sweeping revival of religion in Houston, for in addition to the usual evil influences exerted against what is holy, they have here more of infidelity, subtle, organized, and boldly blasphemous, than I have met in any place of its size in all my journeyings. May God graciously visit Houston with a mighty revival of religion, and that right soon. Another early visitor, John Dancy, took his turn at more concise secular defamation, naming Houston one of the muddiest and most disagreeable places on earth. More settlers arrived, befuddled at the discrepancy between the Eden they'd been promised and the forbidding land that stood before them, the land that stuck stubbornly between the grooves of their boots and wagon wheels. What are we to do with this place, they likely wondered, wading through the dense tangle of vines and sweet gum saplings that stretched across their parcels. How shall I make a home so far from any? The first literature of Houston, then, came as insult. Its first emotion was disappointment, a mounting sense of shame for its very dirt. Stitched together, these early impressions began to write a book of the place. They formed an anthology of offenses. Still, development pressed stubbornly on. The Telegraph and Texas Register soon ran another promotional bit, no doubt encouraged by Augustus, announcing the first successful navigation of Buffalo Bayou by a large vessel. On January 27, 1837, the paper boasted, "The fact proved, the steamboat Laura, Captain Grayson, arrived at the city of Houston some few days since without obstruction. Thus it is proved that Houston will be a port of entry." Slowly but surely, domestication took hold. The city expanded in fits and starts. Developers dredged the bayous, broke their banks into the lots of early subdivisions, and raised the groves of magnolia that once had stood, stately and fragrant, on the territory's sprawling, humid plains. They built merchant centers and exchange posts and a bustling wharf for the transfer of lumber and other goods. In 1837, only a year into the territory's independence and formal status as the Republic of Texas, Houston was named the capital, serving as such until the headquarters was relocated in 1839 to drier, more centralized environs, at a site on the banks of the Colorado River in modern-day Austin. Industrial and agricultural economies gathered momentum in the city's radius, many of sinister and predatory origin. In the late years of slavery in the United States, opportunists from neighboring southern states immigrated from their crowded parcels out east and began raising sugarcane in the nutrient-rich bottomlands of Texas. Land adjacent to major rivers and bayous was sectioned into long, slender tracts, affording each operation port access for export, water supply, and an unlimited store of dense, crimson mud, a commodity that enslaved people harvested, formed into bricks, fired, and used to construct homes and agricultural structures needed for the processing of sugarcane and cotton. These new plots mimicked the plantations of tropical colonies, where enslaved people had long labored in the sweltering brick-house cane-boiling facilities of the Caribbean islands. The neo-plantations of Texas were no less gruesome in their tactics of production, forcing men and women to slog day and night, hovered over scalding vats of boiled syrup, slashing cane in steaming, sun-beaten fields. Soon, in keeping with the bold promises of Augustus Allen, the remote outpost on Buffalo Bayou blossomed into a slave-dependent commercial nexus, distributing sugar and cotton throughout the South and up the East Coast. Following abolition and its enforcement in the late 19th century, Texas sugar plantations in turn gave way to a new device of slavery by another name, converting themselves into operations run on the dubious, state-endorsed convict leasing program, which forced the incarcerated to take up where their ancestors had left off. So-called farmers bought land under the expectation of inheriting such labor as a cheap and renewable resource, enjoying the spoils of that same thick and lucrative mud. Again, a new breed of speculators rolled in. One 1908 real estate flyer for a Houston cane farming plot touted the city's geological good fortune, describing the soil as superior to every region on Earth for the most perfect and profitable growth of sugarcane. Cotton thrived, too, and rice, and some cattle. Roads, merely wet ruts at first, suddenly crisscrossed the region, connecting markets, farms, and residential clusters of homes. In 1856, the Texas legislature voted to make Houston the center of the state's railroad system, beating out the neighboring port of Galveston, and a web of railroads was built, linking hubs to larger port-bound lines. By the turn of the century, the system reached its steel tendrils into fledgling territories to the west and beyond. By 1923, the city had solidified its self-perception as a gatekeeper of commerce across the continent, touting its rail clout in a promotional pamphlet as the city where 17 railroads meet the sea. The city spread like a glass of milk spilled on the wobbling table of Texan plains. What formed was a town with no discernible center, no clear pattern or plan, but a frenetic, haphazard mess of settlement, unbound by neighboring cities or thorough planning of any kind. No cliffs or plunging valleys inhibited the city's sprawl. No sense of urban ethics, aside from the clean absolution of capitalism, the infinite hall pass of opportunity, the wide-open southwestern frontier dictated its shape. A new species of American metropolis emerged, by way of a scattered mess of encampments, neighborhoods, and plantations. Refineries and merchant centers sprang up alongside housing developments and agricultural plots. Meanwhile, highways snaked their way through the confusion. In the early gestures of municipal government, the city officials had voted, as they continue to do in Houston, to forgo the precautionary measures of zoning, thereby freeing the town and its people from the standard regulations of land use. The absence of zoning bred a novel chaos to the way a city might compose itself. Generations later, scholars would compare the city's growth to that of other major urban areas, employing the simile of a living organism. Where more traditional, older towns, cities built on European models of density and walkability, the ancient sense of the urban commons, like New York and Boston, had sprouted like a thriving plant, branching out from their municipal seeds downtown into arms of boroughs and suburbs. The development of Houston unfolded as a decentralized labyrinth. It had no nucleus, obeyed no rules of physics or nature. It grew instead like a gigantic fungus, germinating in pockets of opportunity, dying out, then migrating, exhausting the resources in one host in order to pick up and move irreverently to the next. In time, Houston's method of expansion posed a unique and quickly intensifying problem. To be sure, the city had earned its keep, rising from the mire of skepticism and establishing its viability as a metropolis to be, holding more than 100,000 souls by 1915, more than 500,000 by 1950, and well beyond 1 million by 1969, the same year its name, along with that weighty legacy it bore, became the first word to be spoken from the surface of the moon. Its prominence beamed into expectant living rooms across the nation. Heralded as Space City for its pioneering role in lunar exploration, Houston simultaneously became a purveyor of another kind of space, inflating itself to accommodate a patchwork of many cities within a giant one, swallowing up the dense marsh and forests that once had resisted its emergence. But the bare evidence of its population cannot sustain a city. It is not the size of the place that matters exclusively, nor is it the question of whether its inhabitants can simply fit. Now its dilemma was an existential one. Its future was an environmental equation. As the rate of development multiplied and pads of concrete and houses took over from where water had once stood, the simple issue of feasibility was gone. The city's possibility was no longer a measure of the human ability to buy into the dream, to move there and build. It was a concern, rather, of geological perspective and the limits of land itself. Chapter 2. The Arms of God. A quick reckoning of inundation and all its forms. The iterations of Earth's floods can be broken into a few distinct categories. Some floods require rain, others the whims of isolated bodies of water, the slow but dreadful overflow of dams and levees, the redirection of creeks and rivers, and the swelling of bays. Mercurial and diverse, floods come both instantly and over millennia, arriving on our porch in trivial puddles and in global and fearsome scale. To regard them is science and art, the subject of our most poetic and biblical metaphors. Floods are curses and cleansings, the stuff of cathartic absolution and righteous punishment. Today, the most common floods are given names. There are storm surges, a flood brought on by the momentum of an advancing hurricane, a devastating wall of water shoved across the land. There are flash floods and river floods, which carry their ingredients in their names And there are surface floods, a species that spreads languidly across the land, usually initiated by sustained rain on an area covered in concrete or other.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?